Hi friends, welcome back. Today we are going to be working towards meeting this standard, which is RL.4.2. This is different than last week's. Remember, RI is reading informational, RL is reading literature or literary. And so we're going to be talking more about stories and poems and things like that this week than we are on informational texts. So that's the difference between RI and RL. So let's look at the targets that go with RL 4.2. I can read closely to find details that will help me determine a theme of a story. Now I'm going to highlight some really important words from that target. We're going to be finding details, and those details are going to help us determine the theme of a story. So this standard is all about theme. Now, what are we going to do once we've found the theme? We are going to use the details and the theme of a story to summarize the story. So just like we worked on last week summarizing a nonfiction text, this week we're going to summarize a fictional text or a literary text. And instead of using main idea to summarize the text, we're going to be using theme. So let's go ahead and get started with our lesson. So as you'll probably remember, theme is the main message. It's what the author wants you to learn or know. It's a broad idea or a big idea about life. And here's a huge difference between main idea and theme. Main idea is usually stated, one of the first few sentences in a text. But theme is usually not stated, and it must be inferred. When we make an inference, we take what we read plus what we know. And when we put those together, these two together, what we've read and what we know, that helps us to infer or make an inference about the text. And so when we're determining the theme, it's usually not going to be stated for you in the text. You are going to have to make an inference. And that's why finding theme is a lot more challenging than finding main idea. So let's go ahead and get started by looking at a piece of text and looking at some questions that we can ask ourselves as we're reading to help us determine the theme. So the text that we're going to read is called The Dog and His Reflection. You can see it's really short, okay? Now, as we're reading, we are going to be looking for those details that are going to help us determine the theme or the main message that the author wants us to walk away with. So the questions that we're going to ask ourselves as we are reading are, how did the characters react to obstacles? What important decisions did the characters make? How did the characters grow or change in the story? And then this one is a big one. What did the characters learn? Those details are going to help us find out what the author wants us to learn from reading this text. In other words, the theme. Okay, so remember, on a close read, we read more than once. We read at least 3 times. So the first read, we're just going to read it. So let me mark that down. So on a close read, the first read, we just read it. On the second read, we find the gist or what the text means to you. And on the third read, we should be able to answer questions about the text. Now, of course, the question that we're asking ourselves today is, what's the theme? Okay, what are those details that lead us to the theme, and how are we going to use those to summarize the story? Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing today. So we're in our first part of our close read. We are just going to read it. So let me zoom in on our text here. Okay, so I'm going to read this out loud for our first read because we're just going to read it. On our second read, you are going to pause the video and read it for yourself and find the gist. And then our third read, we're going to work together to answer these questions that I listed below. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. All right. The dog and his reflection. A dog, to whom the butcher had thrown a bone, was hurrying home with his prize as fast as he could go. As he crossed a narrow footbridge, he happened to look down and saw himself reflected in the quiet water, as if in a mirror. But the greedy dog thought he saw a real dog carrying a bone much bigger than his own. If he had stopped to think, he would have known better. But instead of thinking, he dropped his bone and sprang at the dog in the river, only to find himself swimming for dear life to reach the shore. At last he managed to scramble out, and as he stood sadly thinking about the good bone he had lost, he realized what a stupid dog he had been. So that was our first read. We just read it. Now for your second read, you're going to pause the video, read it on your own, and find the gist or what the text means to you. Go ahead and do that. All right, welcome back. So, on our close read for our third read, of course, we just did a first, you just did your second. Now for our third read, we're going to be able to answer questions about the text. So because I've already read it through 2 times, this time we're just going to read bits and pieces of the text to help us answer questions about the text. So we're going to start with these questions, and of course these questions are helping us find details that will help us determine the theme of the story. Okay, so let's look at the first one. How did the characters react to obstacles? Well, in this text there's really only one character. The butcher makes a cameo for about a split second just to give him the bone, but really this character is only the dog. So how did the dog react to obstacles? Well, what obstacle did the dog face? Let's look back at our first paragraph. As he crossed a narrow footbridge, he happened to look down and saw himself reflected in the quiet water as if in a mirror, but the greedy dog thought he saw a real dog carrying a bone much bigger than his own. If he'd stopped to think, he would have known better, but instead of thinking, he dropped his bone and sprang at the dog in the river. Well, how did the character react to obstacles? He dropped his bone and sprang or jumped into the water. And what happened to him? He was swimming for dear life to reach the shore. At last he managed to scramble out, so he sprang into the water and almost drowned. And he lost his bone. Now, was that a great reaction to an obstacle? No, it wasn't. So I want this to be stuck with you because this is really going to help you figure out the theme. How did he react to an obstacle? Was it a good reaction or a bad reaction? I'm going to write here, it was a bad reaction, not a good choice. Okay, so let's look at our second question. What important decisions did the character make? Now, this doesn't say what good decisions, it says what important decisions did the character make. So we learned from this detail, he decided to drop his bone and go for, and I'm going to put in quotes here, a bigger bone, because was there really a bigger bone? Nope, it was just his reflection. So that was an important decision. He decided to drop his own bone and go for the bigger bone that wasn't really there. So that's a pretty important decision that character made. Wasn't a good one, so I'm going to write again. It was a bad decision. Now, how did the characters grow or change in the story? This is a critical question to ask yourself when you are trying to figure out the theme of a story. How did the characters grow or change in the story? Now, as we were reading this short story, we saw towards the end, the author is telling us, well, if he had stopped to think, he would have known better. But is that the dog telling us that, or is that the author telling us that, or the narrator? Yeah, it's the narrator. It's not the dog. So we don't know here what the dog is thinking or how the dog has changed. So let's keep reading. Instead of thinking, he dropped his bone, sprang at the dog in the river, only to find himself swimming for dear life to reach the shore. At last, he managed to scramble out, and as he stood sadly thinking about the good bone he had lost, he realized what a stupid dog he had been. So there's the train. So his growth or his change in the story was he realized, and I'm going to use the words right from the text, what a stupid dog he had been. But why? Because he dropped his good bone. So this is actually some pretty significant growth for this dog, because he recognizes that he made a mistake in dropping this bone. That is a huge element that's going to help you find out the theme. So here's our final question. What did the character learn? Based on these answers to this question, based on the story, what do you think the dog learned? I think the dog learned to not be, I'm going to take a word directly from the text. It said greedy. He learned to not be greedy and be grateful. He was not grateful for the bone that he had. He was being greedy and went after the bone that he thought the other dog had. So I'm thinking he learned not to be greedy, but instead to be grateful. So these questions that we just answered, how did the characters react to obstacles? What important decisions did the characters make? How did the characters grow or change in the story? And what did the characters learn? Those questions, when we put them all together and we find all that information, that's what's going to help us find the theme. Because remember, the theme is not stated in the text. The author does not come out and say, the theme of the story is, we have to infer it. So we just took what we read plus what we know. We know that we should be not greedy and instead we should be grateful. That's something that we know, but that's also something that the dog learned in the text. So this information is going to help us determine the theme. So let's look at our next page. This question has two parts. It's going to go part A and part B. So let's look at part A. What is the lesson or the theme of the dog and his reflection? Is it be happy with what you have? There is usually something better to be discovered. Stop and think through each decision, or be careful not to get tricked. So let's start eliminating some of the ones that we don't think are correct. Excuse me. So going back to the questions that we answered about the dog and his reflection, He lost his bone because he thought that the other dog in the river, who was really his reflection, had a better bone. So he was going to go after that dog's bone. So does that support be happy with what you have? Maybe. So let's not cross that one out just yet. Do you think the lesson is there's usually something better to be discovered? Well, this particular dog, when he discovered the bigger bone, was it actually something better? It was not. So there is usually something better to be discovered is not a theme that's supported by this text. So let's look at letter C. Stop and think through each decision. Now that could be true because the dog didn't really think through the situation. And it even says right here, if he had stopped to think, he would have known better. So that one could be it too, but I'm looking at all of these details that we gathered, and none of them really have to do with stopping and thinking. So I think it might come down to this one or this one, but let's check this one. Be careful not to get tricked. Now, in this particular story, did anything outside of the dog himself trick him? Did the butcher trick him? Did another dog trick him? Did the river trick him? Nope. He did this all to himself, so be careful not to get tricked is not supported in this story as a theme. So we've got it narrowed down to two choices. Be happy with what you have or stop and think through each decision. So I'm looking at this text, I'm looking at these details, and I'm thinking, okay, all right. He had a bad reaction. He dropped his bone, sprang into the water, almost drowned, lost his bone. He decided to drop his bone and go for a bigger bone. He realized what a stupid dog he had been because he dropped his good bone. He learned not to be greedy and to be grateful, because that's exactly what the text says. He was thinking about the good bone he had lost, and he realized what a stupid dog he had been. Which one do you think best supports the theme of the dog and his reflection? I'm thinking that because he learned not to be greedy and to be grateful, I'm thinking that the lesson that the author wants us to learn is be happy with what you have. Because the dog learned, he was thinking about that good bone he had lost. He should have been happy with what he had instead of trying to, take a bone from another dog. So let's meet the second part of our learning target where we use those details to support. So which one of these details do you think best supports be happy with what you have? But the greedy dog thought he saw a real dog carrying a bone much bigger than his own. Ooh, it has the word greedy in it, so that could be it. If he stopped to think, he would have known better. Now this detail would absolutely be correct if we had chosen C, but because we didn't choose C, this one doesn't support this theme. It supports a theme that we thought it could be, so we've got to be really careful when we're answering questions like this. All right, he dropped the bone and sprang at the dog in the river, only to find himself swimming for dear life to reach the shore. Well, this does talk about how he dropped his bone, but then it just gives us information about what happened once he dropped his bone. And then this last one, he realized what a stupid dog he had been. So which one of those details do you think best supports the theme, be happy with what you have? I'm thinking it narrows it down to either A or D, because C is really just giving us information about what happened once he dropped the bone. But A tells us that he was greedy, and then D tells us he realized what a stupid dog he had been. Which one do you think it is, friends? All right, so I'm gonna go with A, because this detail tells us that he was a greedy dog. The reason that he was not happy with what he had is because he thought he saw a real dog carrying a bone much bigger than his own. So that detail tells us that he was not happy with what he had in the story, which supports why we should be happy with what you have. These questions down here are all, or these details down here are all really close. I would say this one's probably a distractor because, yep, it's a detail that tells us he realized what a stupid dog he had been, but it didn't tell us that he wasn't happy with what he had, which is what this detail does. Awesome. So let's go back to our targets. Did we read closely to find details that will help us determine the theme of a story? We sure did. Now, we are going to use those details and the theme to summarize the story. Now, remember, a good summary. It's short. It states the title and author. That's a huge one, because if you just start spouting off the theme and the details without telling us the title, we don't really know what you're talking about. So I'm noticing friends who are writing their main idea summaries, you're forgetting the title. That is critical. Do not forget the title. Now in this particular text, we don't have an author, so we don't need an author for this one. All right, a good summary tells the theme or main idea. Now remember, theme is literary, main idea is informational. So we're going to be doing theme today. And it includes the most important supporting details. I would say, remember, we need 2. Probably don't need more than 3. I would say 2 to 3 because, again, we want it to be short. Always write it in complete sentences. Always use correct capitalization and punctuation. So that's exactly what we're going to do down here. We are going to write a summary of the dog and his reflection. So remember how we do that. We start with our quotation marks because we're writing the title of a short story, The Dog and His Reflection. We also need those phrases that tell us what is happening or what we're about to share. So the dog and his reflection. You know what? I would even say the theme of the dog and his reflection is, and I can just go back up here, be happy with what, my goodness, you have. So if that's hard to read, I apologize. It just says the theme of the dog and his reflection is be happy with what you have. Oh my goodness. So we are going to set up our next sentence, which is going to be the most important supporting details. I know this because the text states. Now, if I use states, I have to copy directly from the text, which is not going to be hard because look, I have a detail right here. So I know this because the text states, the greedy dog thought he saw a real dog. I keep capitalizing dog here, I guess because the main character, carrying a bone much bigger than his own. Now I use the ellipsis here because I didn't include but the. I left those words out, so that ellipsis, that magical tool that says I don't have to include that, so I'm not going to. All right, so far we've got the title, we've got the theme, we've got one supporting detail, so we're still missing one supporting detail. So I'm going to come back to the text and I'm going to find one more detail that helps me determine that the dog learned be happy with what you have. I like this one. I'm going to go back to this one right here. He stood sadly thinking about the good bone he had lost. So that right there, he was thinking about what he had. So I'm going to say, the text also tells us, now remember, I don't have to use exactly the words from the text. I can use my own words as long as I'm getting the same message across. So the text also tells us that the dog was sad because he lost his good bone. So let's read that summary together. The theme of The Dog and His Reflection is be happy with what you have. I know this because the text states, the greedy dog thought he saw a real dog carrying a bone much bigger than his own. The text also tells us that the dog was sad because he lost his good bone. So, if this is our summary, is it short? Yes. Does it have the title? Yes. Does it tell the theme? Yes. Does it include the most important supporting details, 2 to 3? Yes. Did I write incomplete sentences? You can see I have capital letters at the beginning. I have periods and punctuation at the end. Yep. I've used correct capitalization and punctuation. I am crushing this summary. So, when you are determining the theme of a story, you need to make sure you remember it's the lesson the author wants you to learn. It's a big idea about life, and it's usually not stated in the text. You've got to infer it. Take what you read plus what you know. So let's go back to our second target. Did we use the details and the theme of the story to summarize the story? You sure did. So when you're working this week on theme, that is exactly what you are going to do, my friends. You are going to use those details to find the theme. You're going to use the theme and details to write a summary. I hope that you have a great week. And remember, come back to this video as many times as you need to practice finding theme. Have a great day.